Hello, and welcome to another World of UX podcast. This is your host, Darren Hood. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. A special welcome, as always, to those of you joining us for the first time, whether you're listening by audio or you're watching our new video. Yay, we're enjoying producing the videos. I'm still on vacation. So for those of you that don't know what that means, I'm not recording a brand new set for this particular episode. What I have been doing is I've been coming across old talks that I've delivered, and they're podcast worthy. So I'm sharing them on the podcast. I'm getting them ready to share on the show. So a lot of people were watching last week. We shared the 4 pillars of UX with some folks that never heard me talk about before and had never seen the talk. And a lot of people actually chimed in to that. We're going to continue that. This is the 3rd in a series of these that I'm doing. This time I'm going to share the talk, Design Processes Are Overrated. So go ahead, sit back, enjoy. If you're caught up with processes, if you're dealing with people about design processes, if you want to really know what's going on and what the truth is about design processes, this episode is for you. Let's go ahead and dive in, shall we? See you at the end.
Good morning, everybody. Well, good evening. Well, where you are, actually, it's 10 minutes to 10 o'clock here in Michigan. But we are very happy to be here presenting for the UX London healthcare folks, or UX healthcare, I should say. And looking at some of the other topics that folks have been presenting, I'm thinking that I might be a little off the beaten path, because I'm going to be talking about, instead of talking about healthcare, I'm going to be talking more about design processes. So we're sort of talking about, from a broad perspective, about getting the work done and some of our attitudes that we should have in order to be excellent in our UX design work. So the topic, design processes are overrated. And so let's go ahead and dive in. And I like to explain that what I'm doing here is really think of it as a hypothesis, and then I'll address some things about it as we go forward. But for those of you, some of you who do not know me, just a little bit about me on a personal level. I've been doing UX and HCI work now for actually 26 years. I need to update this, but 26 years in total. I'm just presenting that all the time. I designed my first website in 1995. I've got a master's in UX from Syracuse University. I've got a UX related master's degree, I should say, from Syracuse University. I've got a UX master's degree, UX design master's degree from Kent State University, where I also serve as an adjunct professor. I also serve as an adjunct professor for Lawrence Tech University, and I'm about to become an adjunct professor for Michigan State University as well. You see the World Usability Day logo in the upper right-hand segment there. That's just an indicator of my frequent speaking engagements. I speak all over the world on a regular basis. And so that just to represent and share that there. Bottom left, we got our cat, one of our cats there, Rocky, my wife and I. That's my beautiful wife, Angela. You see in the middle there. We love cats. We have 4 of them. I'm a big photographer. I absolutely love photography. If you ever want to know something about photography or want to talk about photography, reach out to me. I'm head of a photography group. I'm part of the TEDx Detroit photography team, and I'm an award-winning photographer as well. So love talking about photography as well. You see the bicycle there because from a health perspective, I'm part of what I call the 100-pound club. I lost 100 pounds, and a great deal of it, 2/3 of it actually, were due to bicycling. And so I love bicycling. I hadn't ridden a bicycle for over 30 years, got back into bicycling and absolutely loving it. And then the last item you see there is a screenshot, or a picture, I should say, from my first sanctioned 300 game in bowling. I used to be a professional bowlers association member, and I enjoy bowling. Been bowling since I was a little kid. My dad taught me how to bowl when I was 6 and picked it up and ran off with it. So just a little bit about me on a personal level. From a professional perspective, you can see my professional footprint here. And just to give you an idea of where I've worked, this is not all inclusive. It's just a representation of the type of places that I worked, the types of businesses that I've been engaged with. Some of these I'm hoping will be familiar to many of you, and some may not be. But it's just to let you know, not only have I been around since 95, but I've worked at what I like to refer to as the top of the food chain. I've worked in Fortune 50, I've worked in Fortune 500, I've worked in Fortune 1000. And so I know what it's like to be involved in UX from an enterprise perspective. So just like sharing a little bit on the personal side, a little bit on the professional side, now let's go. Let us dive in. And we're going to start off by level setting. I love to level set because it's good for us to be on the same page when we get started with these talks. So we're all thinking the same exact thing, defining things the same way, using terminology the same way. So the thought again today is design processes are overrated. Well, what is a process? What is it exactly? According to the Cambridge Dictionary, a process is a series of actions taken in order to achieve a result. So it's basically the steps. It's the things that we do in order to get things done, basically. And the emphasis, mine, the italics, that's on me because I want the bold part to stand out. Another definition, and this one is coming from the dude that's giving the presentation, is basically a repeatable, formulaic way to get things done. Now, you may already have an idea where I'm going when I say that design processes are overrated, because no matter what process is being used, and we're going to illustrate a few so you can see the similarities, see what's really going on with different processes, sort of, and really talk about some processes some folks might not be familiar with. It's always about getting the work done, no matter what it is. Even if somebody is just flying by the seat of their pants, that might be their process, really. And we don't like to think of it that way, but that's how some people operate. They do things from a very whimsical perspective. And so they have a whimsical process, but it's still the way that they're getting things done. So we want to make sure that we understand that. A little bit about processes from a factoid perspective. Factoid number one, processes are basically automatic. No matter what you're working on, no matter who you're working on it with, no matter what you're trying to accomplish, we always end up settling into some type of process. We always end up approaching work a particular way. You can start off, even when I sort of joking around, talking about people who do design from a whimsical perspective, even when people engage in whimsy, they end up doing certain things, they make certain things repeatable. And every time they go to do the work, they keep repeating those same things. So it's automatic. You're going to end up in a process no matter what. Factoid number two, processes are basically second nature. It is in us to, if you start out, you could be cutting your grass, you could be washing a vehicle, you could be going for a walk, you could be doing anything. And if you start out doing it a particular way, we always end up trying to come up with a way to optimize what it is that we're doing. So a slightly redundant from the first factoid, but processes are second nature. We're always going to do it. And once we do things repeatedly, then eventually we don't think about it. We just automatically do it. And that's a little bit more from a second nature perspective there. Factoid number three, processes are inevitable. You're not going to be able to escape a process. You can start out with whimsy, but you'll always gravitate toward doing certain things from a systematic perspective. Processes are indeed inevitable. So why do I present these? It's because when you look at the title, again, design processes are overrated. I want to make sure that people understand, as we are level setting still, that I'm not saying that design processes are bad. I'm not saying that at all. As a matter of fact, and I promise to do my absolute best Yoda impression here, processes, they are. Processes are good for all the Star Wars fans out there. Processes are good. We're not saying that processes are bad by any stretch of the imagination. So, but processes, they're a reality. There's something we're going to have to deal with. And there's no shortage of them. Everywhere we look, there are processes. So what we're going to do now is we want to take a look at a few. We want to take out our design process Rolodex. And we want to just look at some of what's out there, some of what people have been using over the years. And I'm going to show you why I say that they're overrated. And then at the end, I want to give a big challenge to some people because of some things that I'm seeing happen in the UX world with regard to design processes that is problematic. Because you can use whatever process you want, truth be told. And I'm getting ahead of myself. You'll see what I mean, why I say that in a moment. For those of you who might be like me, I got into UX through instructional design. And at one time, the predominant process for getting training done, for designing training, was what's called ADDIE. And the 5 steps of ADDIE, that's an acronym, of course, and analyze, design, develop, implement, evaluate. This is the way that we approach things. And one of the things I found interesting about this, and I transitioned into UX from instructional design. Initially, I used ADDIE when I was doing my first UX design projects. Of course, we didn't call it UX design when I first got into it. But when I was working on things, I just used it. I took the same process and I brought it with me. I didn't know about any processes, but I just thought on the design side of things when it came to digital design, but I didn't see a reason to not use this. So I brought it with me. There were some people down the years who they used ADDIE in the instructional design world, and they felt that they could improve upon it. So they came up with what's called the 5C framework, and that's what you're seeing here. And those 5 steps are capture, conceptualize, we're going counterclockwise here, capture, conceptualize, create, then cultivate, and then commercialize. And that commercialize is a stretch. I can't talk about this without talking about how, just frankly, how silly that is. They really wanted to make sure that everything started with a C. Just deliver, deploy, and you're going to see the vanity in some of the terminology as we continue to go forth in this talk. Again, capture, conceptualize, create, cultivate, commercialize. Did they really change anything? when you look at ADDIE and keep that thought, and I'll show you. We'll have these side by side so you can see them shortly. Next, we have Jesse James Garrett's 5 planes. Now, some people don't think of this as a design process. Early in my career, I went from ADDIE to this. I learned this 2002, 2003, and I began to associate specific tasks with each one of the steps, each one of these planes. And I found it to be extremely beneficial. I found that it helped me to optimize my efficiency. And so I'm sure there are some other people that were doing the same thing, possibly some of you who are familiar with this. Maybe you used Jesse James Garrett's 5 planes at one time. But I thought that it was really helpful. I thought it was beneficial. I thought it was great. But just another idea of going through the user needs and the site objectives. From there, you go to your start to work on your functional specifications and your content requirements. From there, you start to work on your interaction design and your information architecture. One side is talking about the web, and the other side, as far as the SaaS kind of an approach, or the software as a system, where the things you're working with online have an interface per se, because you're trying to get work done with a system that's being offered through a browser, whereas web is a hypertext system. That's your basic website, just to give some clarity with regard to what you see on screen here. So interaction design, information architecture. Then when you go to plane 4, you've got interface design, and then navigation design. Basically, it's information design. And really accurately, that plane and the third plane overlap a bit, because information design and information architecture are related. And then visual design is the 5th plane. Quick note, UX professionals don't really work on the visual design. We only work on the first 4. UI people work on the visual design, and there is no such thing as UX UI. I'm sure I'm going to bust somebody's bubble by saying that today, but it really isn't. So we work on the first 4 planes. Now, we don't work on the visual design, but do we care about it? Absolutely. We want to make sure that the contrast is appropriate. We want to make sure it's aesthetically pleasing. We're going to collaborate with the UI people to make sure that we're applying, or that the UX principles have been properly applied to the UI work. So, but they're responsible for making it look good. We make sure that it's solid and that people can find things they're looking for, and that the cognitive load is low and things like that. That's what we focus on with the first 4 planes here. Next, we've got agile methodology. And funny thing about this is some people don't see this as a process, but it actually is. And so with agile, you start out with your planning, then you get into your requirements analysis, you start designing. Once you're all set with your design, now people can start to actually build things. And so development begins. You start to test, and that could include usability testing as well. Any type of testing that is a part of making that project successful will take place at that level, and then you deploy. Iteration is going to be part of this as well. It doesn't have to be listed here. We know that that's part of agile work, but this is just, it's another process, and it's probably the predominant process that you see in the design world today. But the funny thing is, everybody doesn't do agile the same way. So this is something worth noting. I find that a little humorous. Then we have double diamond. And with double diamond, we have, you start, it's really divided into 2 phases. Hence double diamond 2, asking, listening, and sorting, creating, testing, and designing. That's number 2. In the first part, you have a problem, then you define the problem, then you give the solution, and you split that up into 4 phases, basically, to get it done. First, we need to understand what's taking place. What are we really addressing? What problem are we solving? Who are we solving it for? We start to define things. We start to come up with different ways that we can approach and resolve and address the design problems that we understood in the first phase. Then we move to the create, test, design segment, and we start to develop things. It's starting to sound familiar. Is this starting to sound redundant to anyone? I mean, I can't see the chat, but it should. And if it does, you're not off base. It is getting redundant. You start to develop, and then after you develop and you're confident and you feeling good about what you've got, you finalize the design, and you can iterate. You can continue to iterate throughout the process, but it's basically those 4 phases, and they're divided into 2 groups of 2, but that's double diamond. Then we've got yet another one here. We've got the Envision UX design process, or we should say processes, because it's really funny that Envision actually has 2. If you go to the Envision site, they list 2 different design processes. So I find that that's a little interesting, but it's not odd to see something like that, because people just keep creating different things and contradicting things. But I'll stop there, because that'll take me down a rabbit hole. I don't want to go there. If we look at the first UX design process that they have here, they mention research, skip the typo, research, exploration, and creation, and validation, and iteration. Okay, and that's fine. And they make it a point to make it clear how the iteration part works. And it really applies in exploration and validation. So pretty thorough, no problems with this. The other one that I found on their site involves 6 steps: understanding, researching, then analyzing, designing, launching, and then analyzing again. It's the first time I've ever seen anybody say that, mention analyze in that way. Some people would just say, well, iteration. But if you look at these 2, they're not too much different than one another either. Matter of fact, you're almost splitting hairs to an extent, trying to make a difference between from one process to the other. Then the last design process that we have, and this one is becoming popular. I'm not a fan. I'll say that. And it's for many reasons, some of which I'll explain shortly. But design thinking involves, in some cases, 5 steps. Some people say there's 6. The thoughts are pretty much everywhere. But first you empathize, which is not really clearly defined, but I'm trying not to go down a rabbit hole, so I'll leave that there. Empathize, then you define, then you ideate, then you prototype, and then you test. So it's basically a 5-step process. that you get into. Now, one of the things that I will bring up about design thinking is that, and I've got a few examples here. Look at the first one in the upper left. There's 6 steps, and then you got another one has 5, and then the next one has 5. Then the one in the bottom right-hand corner actually came from the people who came up with design thinking, and nobody is saying the same thing that they were saying. That came from the folks at IDEO. And so the thoughts are all over the place, but look at it closely. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, implement. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test. Discovery, interpretation, ideation, experimentation, evolution. And then, wow, with IDEO, design challenge, research, synthesis, ideate, prototype, test, refine, deliver. And look at this, here's 3 more. First one has 5 steps. The second one has 10. And that's sort of taking it and they're expanding on design thinking a little bit. So that's not really fair to include that, but just to show you where some people are going when it comes to design thinking. And then the bottom one has 9 steps in it. So without going through each one of these, you can see that the world of design thinking is all over the place. And really, when you look at it, they're saying somewhat the same thing, though the steps are different. The one interesting thing that I find about design thinking is that some people are actually starting to explain design thinking in such a way that all they're talking about is UX. They just put a different name on it. So it's critical to understand that today as well. Now, after you see all of this, if your head is spinning, if you see this is redundant with regard to design thinking, what in the world is it? I hear people talking about it all the time. What conclusions should I draw? Some people feel they've got it. Some people are confused. Some people look somewhat confident, but they're pensive. They don't get it. Design thinking has been very, very confusing, and it really has not achieved what a lot of people think it has achieved. So we'll talk about that maybe another time. How about we sum it up like this? Don Norman recently in a talk on where he was talking about where the direction of design is headed in these days, he said design thinking by itself is worthless. That's enough for me. Don Norman feels that way. And he says that after he's examined what's going on in the discipline. He said that as he's examined the benefits that come from design thinking and the prescribed benefits, it's worthless by itself. And he's actually correct. There are some things in it that are okay, but we can't shift from UX, which is this large organizational element and mode of operation, to paring it down to 5 steps that used to be done by experts and are now done by people who don't understand design. There's no way you're going to accomplish a lot like that. Then I guess it'll be a few more years before folks get it. But Don Norman said, by itself, it is worthless. Now, here's our high level look. Now, look at all of these that we just went over. A lot of stuff that we just covered, but it's still high level look. But when you just look at the terminology, when you look at some people would say that, oh, this is just semantics. You're sort of right. You're right in a sense, which is part of why I'm saying that design processes are really overrated. But this will come full circle. You have to hear the whole presentation to understand why I'm saying that completely. Now, it's overrated from the perspective that when you look at all these things, it's basically the same. Now, if you have a hard time looking at this, how about this? So what we did was we've taken each one of the design processes that we just reviewed. We're putting them side by side. ADDIE, analyze, design, develop, implement, evaluate. The 5C framework: capture, conceptualize, create, cultivate, commercialize. 5 planes: gather needs and objectives, gather your requirements and your specs, work on your information architecture, your interaction design, then work on your navigation, your interface, and your information design. And then lastly, Now, with everything else in place, you can work on your visual design. With Agile, you've got planning, requirements analysis, design, development, testing, and deployment. Double Diamond, you've got understand, define, develop, and finalize. Envision, and we'll just use one of the Envision models. Understand, research, analyze, design, launch, and then analyze again. And then design thinking, basically the average school of thought: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Is anything different really happening here? Accurately? Of a truth from a practical perspective when it comes to getting the work done? No, we just have the same door. It's just painted different colors. That's pretty much all it is. When you look at everything that's going on with design processes, now there may be some slight variations. Matter of fact, there is a version of the Double Diamond that, in addition, it talks about who's responsible for executing certain things. They add a layer of organization to it that I found to be practical. And of all of those, Double Diamond is my favorite. If I had to pick one, I'd say Double Diamond. I actually dropped 5 planes for a Double Diamond, but then again, same door, different color. You're not doing a lot of things differently. And when you have been practicing for a long time, the other thing that's funny about design processes is that, for those of you who might be familiar with the book Thinking Fast and Slow, when you do work and the whole thing becomes second nature, you no longer depend upon check boxes to get the work done. So you just do it. It's second nature. You go from system 1 to system 2 thinking, and now you do things automatically. So now you really have to throw the process out the window because you're not really counting on it anymore. You know what to do to get the work done. Nice and simple. So let's think about the bottom line. No matter what process you're using, and you can use any process, it does not matter. I mean, imagine, if you will, and no matter what you're working on, let's pretend they're teapots for the purpose of this example. 5 different companies working on 5 different solutions, and the end, whatever you do, is going to look like a teapot. In other words, it's a product. It's a solution. So that's our common denominator. That's our common ground, is that you're going to end up making something, and we're going to envision it as a teapot. One company uses Double Diamond, another company uses 5 planes, 2 companies use design thinking, and another company uses the Envision method. When you're done, nobody knows. The people who are going to partake of your product, they don't know what you used. And you know what? They really don't even care. They just want the solution that you provide to meet their needs. So every company uses whatever process works for your company. And what works for one company may not work for another. That's another reason that design processes are overrated, because when the day is done, you have a product. You have a solution. Hopefully, a product and a solution that's going to meet the needs of your organization and also meet the need of the users, the customer. Because if it doesn't, you've got to blend business needs with user needs. If you address user needs but not business needs, and vice versa, that's a fail. But basically, you're going to follow a process. You're going to roll out a product. So how you got there is not so much a big deal. When you see the numbers come in and everybody, let's say all 5 of these companies are successful, all 5 of these companies are successful, are they going to talk about the processes when they're celebrating the success? They're not. The C-suite people, the only people that care about the process are the people who are doing their retros after the fact to talk about what worked and what didn't and what can we do better and things of that nature. And I know that's an agile thing, but folks are doing that even when it's not agile. Again, showing you that design processes are overrated. But here's the big part. This is one of the things that gets missed. And here's the trend. I sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, that there's a big part, overlooked aspect of what's going on with overemphasis on design processes today, is that this melodramatic look at design processes is starting to impact recruiting. A lot of times when you're interviewing someone for a job, if you are interviewing for a job, you're either going to ask someone about their design processes, or you're going to be asked about your design processes. And here's where the overrating of design processes really takes on a pinnacle role that it should not. People are making decisions about who to hire and who not to hire based on their design processes. Remember, design processes are overrated, and they're all the same, basically, when it comes to actually getting work done. Let's say you're interviewing someone and you want someone who's familiar with Agile. You want somebody who's familiar with Agile. Okay, that's great. What if they're not? How long does it take, especially when you consider that Agile is different from company to company? So the fact that somebody might be familiar with Agile means nothing, because your company is going to do it differently than another. So if somebody, whether they know Agile or not, if you put too much emphasis on, from a requirement perspective of a person having experience with Agile, you might miss out on a phenomenal talent, because they're going to have to onboard with Agile anyway, because of the aforementioned factor. When we put too much emphasis on processes during the recruiting process, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to make bad decisions. We're going to welcome somebody because they're familiar, and then you put so much emphasis on it that you really don't realize that they are or are not really qualified to do the work. We want to make sure that we're looking at processes the right way. The only thing you need to know is that the person understands the importance of process. Other than that, what they used really doesn't matter, because somebody can transition from one process to another just like that. So let's not put all that emphasis that we see on recruiting or on processes when it comes to recruiting these days. So wrapping up, a process is basically a series of actions that produce a result. Nothing more, nothing less. They're inevitable, they're second nature, and good they are. So process is going to be okay. No shortage of options. So I just covered 7. There's way more than 7 options out there. And some of them are used in combination with one another. So go figure. So you got to keep that in mind. No shortage of options out there. They all, however, are, practically speaking, they're all the same. They're all the same. And all of them produce, in the end, a deliverable. That's it. They produce a deliverable. So the best process is the one that best serves your organization needs. Be flexible, do what you need to do, get the work done, and you'll find sometime that you'll switch a process, or at least parts of it, from project to project. So no sense in overrating anything. It's good to have processes, but keep them focused. Make sure that you're using it for what they're intended for getting the work done, not for evaluating talent. That's not what it's for, because it actually, when you do that, it causes you to engage in discriminatory employee evaluation practices, or candidate evaluation practices, and you don't want to be there. Remember, it's only necessary to confirm that a person understands the value and the necessity of process. And here's a little quick side note. I've seen sometimes where people say, here is the UX design process. There is no such thing as as if there's only one. There's a whole bunch of them, so don't fall for that hype. And lastly, if processes are used beyond their original intent or not seen for what they are, then they are, the whole premise that I'm talking to you about here today, overrated. That is it for the talk, folks. If you want to know where you can find me.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for taking the time to listen to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to share Those of you who've been sharing and spreading the word about the podcast, thank you very much. Go to Kaizen Tees. If you haven't done it already, go to kaizentees.com. Check out our merchandise, check out our t-shirts, check out our sweatshirts, check out our polo shirts, check out our mugs, check out our little notebooks. Like to take notes? Do it with a UX is not UI notebook. We have those out there too. A lot of different stuff. But again, thanks for taking the time. We are out of time for today. We're going to wrap it up here. So until next week, this is Darren Hood, the host of The World of UX, signing off. Happy UXing, everybody.